Hi, I'm Stephen Betts. You're listening to Scholars and Saints. Today on Scholars and Saints, I'm chatting with Dr. Cristina Rosetti about a controversial new document making the rounds on Latter-day Saint social media called the Latter-day Saint Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto. Today, we'll situate the manifesto within its broad historical context and compare it with similar groups among other Christian denominations. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Cristina Rosetti here today. Dr. Rosetti is a religious studies scholar with expertise in Mormon studies, including Mormon fundamentalism and other non-LDS Mormonisms. She's a lecturer at UC Riverside and Salt Lake Community College, and her current project is a biography of Mormon fundamentalist leader Joseph W. Musser, which is under contract with the University of Illinois Press. Thanks for being with us here today, Cristina.
Thanks for having me.
So, Cristina, we're talking today about a recent document that's been creating quite a stir in Mormon circles. It's called the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto. So the manifesto, which can be found at latterdayorthodoxy.org, is a document that stakes out what the authors see as a kind of third way between what they call unbridled progressivism and obstinate fundamentalism. The manifesto defines orthodoxy as, quote, fidelity to revealed truth, the institutional church, and the Lord's authorized representatives, and therefore rejects the excesses of progressivism. The, quote, radical in radical orthodoxy refers to, quote, bold exploration beyond what is familiar, and therefore rejects the obstinateness of fundamentalism. What sets apart the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto is the number of prominent Latter-day Saint intellectuals, people like Fiona and Terrell Givens, Ralph Hancock, Daniel Peterson, and others who have become signatories to the document. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the concept of orthodoxy in this manifesto, in Mormonism broadly, and we're going to use the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto as a kind of launching point to explore this concept in Christianity and in religion more broadly. We'll talk about just what it means to be Orthodox in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has long emphasized orthopraxy, or right practice, over orthodoxy or right belief. And we'll look at orthodoxy in other strands of Mormonism and look at other Christian movements like radical orthodoxy among Anglicans, as well as the rad-trad or radical traditionalism movement in Catholicism. Finally, we'll consider what the concept of orthodoxy tells us about religion itself. But first, let's get some background, Cristina, on sort of these concepts of progressivism and fundamentalism that the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto sees itself as responding to.
Yeah, so one of the hard things about this document is that these are all complicated words that have historical meaning. They have meant different things in different places. This is especially true when we'll talk about the relationship generally with secularism and what all of that kind of good stuff means. But to talk a little bit about those two poles that they've kind of created, fundamentalism is a word that I know a little bit about within a Mormon context, because it's a word that means something in Mormonism, and it means something in Christianity as well. Beginning in the 1930s, the word fundamentalism was synonymous with the Mormons of Southern Utah who continued the practice of polygamy. In light of Heber J. Grant finally really ending it, these were Latter-day Saints that didn't want to. And so when we talk about fundamentalism in Mormonism, and when I use the word Mormon fundamentalist, I'm using the word the way Elder Mark E. Peterson and Elder Boyd K. Packer used the word, because they very much meant fundamentalism as polygamy. So that's a complicated word choice that they chose to talk about obstinate fundamentalism, because that word means something. But bigger than that, historically, this word referred to Lyman Stewart's view of the fundamentals, which Protestant Christians in the 1910s sought to outline. And of course, the fundamentals are the virgin birth and the deity of Jesus. But the fundamentals were also not Mormon and not Romanist and not evolution and so Mormons have never been that. So that word's weird. And, the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto is using a very colloquial version of fundamentalism. I don't see the historic use of the word happening at all. What I see them talking about Desnat.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Desnat, for our listeners who may be unfamiliar, is self-described as not a movement. It's a I guess you could say, a loose organization of Latter-day Saints who identify with a particular strand of conservative thought within a Mormon worldview. And it's an online movement that often manifests on Twitter, Facebook, and some of their central beliefs are in a kind of, a radical adherence to prophetic authority in the person of the president of the LDS Church, as well as kind of standard conservative positions on a variety of social issues. What would you add to that, Cristina, on Desnat?
It's an abbreviation for Deseret nationalism,
right.
Which Deseret, the nation of Deseret, they would very much articulate themselves as being radically devoted to the prophet, to the teachings of the church, to truthfulness of the restored gospel. Of course, the things that come with that are Groyper memes, and Groyper memes have a particular meaning colloquially. We learned that from the alt-right, and I know that a lot of Desnat people would argue that they're not alt-right, and so I do want to note that. However, if you use the N-word enough and use a Groyper meme enough together, it's going to project an image. So yes, it is a very kind of right, socially and religiously identity of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. And it is reacting to something, which of course we're going to talk about on the other side. And so, yes, on the fundamental side, I see them talking about this very stringent way of being a Latter-day Saint, which really only ever exists in response to something else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the key elements of the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto that stands out to me is this commitment to a kind of civic discourse, to politeness, to all of the things that I think they would argue Desnat is not doing in the name of what may be ideologically similar commitments. This is what the authors of the manifesto see as a third way between what they're characterizing as fundamentalism and progressivism. So maybe let's talk a little bit about who are these progressives that they're talking about?
Yeah, so very similarly, progressivism is also a historically situated word that always kind of meant something. At the time when the Protestant fundamentalist movement was rising, it really meant higher biblical criticism. It meant the movement that became the social gospel of applying progressive democratic ways of being to Christianity and vice versa, how Christianity can speak to social ills, especially in the time of the Great Depression. And this becomes kind of a progressive way of thinking about Christianity. Now, is progressive Mormonism doing similar in that they're seeking to, end child labor and be part of the temperance movement? No, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about a Mormonism that is heavily influenced by politics, and their Mormonism influences their political views and vice versa. So really, they're talking about progmos. And we'll talk about how this all kind of really exists on the internet, but they're talking about the progmos, who Desnat has given us that name for them. And we see that word flying around also Twitter and Reddit and Facebook.
Yeah, so progmos, progressive Mormons, the stereotype is, obviously these are going to be primarily people in the United States. A lot of this discussion centers on political issues in that are pretty particular to the United States, and sort of conventional polarities in politics between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, broadly construed. So they're kind of responding to this a sense of embattledness from what they perceive to be a corruption of the purity of Latter-day Saint doctrine and practice, particularly, I think, as it relates to things like gender and sexuality. One of the really big issues for, I think, both the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto and Desnat is the issue of the family proclamation and what sorts of implications and what sorts of demands that makes on Latter-day Saints. So maybe say more about that, Cristina, if you would.
There's been 3 proclamations in recent time: the Proclamation on the Family, the Living Christ, and the Proclamation on the Restoration. Of course, the one we hear the most about is the Family Proclamation. And proclamations are interesting in Mormonism in that Latter-day Saints have manifestos, declarations, and proclamations, and the intricacies of what makes things what is something that I don't know the answer of what makes something a proclamation versus a declaration versus a manifesto, and when things become what. I don't know if you have a solid answer on proclamation versus declaration.
No, No, I don't. With the exception of course, what we call today colloquially the manifesto, or the two manifestos, right? 1890 and 1904 on the ending of polygamy in the LDS Church are canonized revelations, considered canonized revelations, as are the declarations, right?
Right. And so that's kind of that's a curious thing, is when proclamations become declarations, and when that remains the big question that I think undergirds a lot of these contestations, is when things become canon and what canon means in a Latter-day Saint context. Because of course, for many would argue that the Proclamation and the Living Christ are canon. However, they have not been added to the DNC. And so is there a possibility for them to be added to the DNC? Will they ever? How much weight do they hold comparatively? They are not in the quad that you carry to church on Sunday. And so because of that kind of gray, sticky area, which many would argue is not a gray area at all, it has created this way for people this embattled way of being a Latter-day Saint on the internet, of like, we don't have to agree with the ideas in the Proclamation, or we do desperately, because so the nature of revelation in the Latter-day Saint tradition has created kind of this problem.
Exactly. And certainly this problem has come into higher relief during the presidency of Russell Nelson in the last couple of years. Revelation is obviously, the concept of revelation and what constitutes a revelation have been really big and important central issues in his administration. And those things are contested between these groups. So yeah, like we said, this issue of gender and sexuality, this particularly came to the fore in the late 90s. Of course, the Family Proclamation itself is coming out in a historical context that's related to legal battles over the potential for gay marriage. And of course, that, continues to ramp up in the early 2000s with Prop 8 in California and things like that. And so this is an ongoing issue of navigating, the church's stance and individual stances towards LGBTQ persons, as well as even definitional issues of does the church recognize transgender individuals on their own terms, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of a very loose characterization of how people refer to progmos, is again this kind of generically liberal American Mormons, right?
Right. And to touch on something that you mentioned, I think is really important, is the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto very much said that they want to, quote, influence the culture of the church. And the authors mentioned that it can be adopted by individual members. It can be adopted by the church, various organizations in the church. But like you said, much of what they're speaking to is a veiled sense of American religion. To my knowledge, none of the signatories live outside of the United States, particularly. So this is an American document. Recently, there were articles circulating on Mormonism as an American religion, which was, the Atlantic article that we saw recently. And that exists up against this tension that the Latter-day Saint movement has been in the last few years, of arguing that they are a global faith. And in light of being a global faith, we now have this document that is seeking to influence the culture of the church, but is very particularly American. And not only is it particularly American, it is speaking to an internet version of an American faith. Because, for example, Sister so-and-so in Payson, who is part of ward council and has a calling and is just being a Latter-day Saint, has probably not heard of DESNAT, has probably not heard of the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto. And we'll talk more about this in light of, the rad trad movement, but it is speaking to an American version of this kind of new age of being religious on the internet, which is, there's a whole, range of scholarship to be done on what it means to be religious in the internet age. But I think this is part of that very particularly.
So Cristina, in the other non-LDS Mormon traditions that you research, what role does the concept of orthodoxy play there? Do we see similar tensions between, these ideas of progressives and fundamentalists in those movements?
Yeah, so again, that word is tricky. When I say Mormonism, I don't mean it to be inflammatory at all. I mean it in that, or to go against in any way, President Nelson's call to not use that word. I use it because the Mormons I study still want to be Mormons. They'll call themselves Mormon. They're not Latter-day Saints. They are, but they're not part of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. And so fundamentalism is tricky there in that they embrace that word, the word given to them by their leaders and solidified by Marky Peterson, that it's almost a battle cry for a lot of people that they are the fundamentalists, and it's a word that they're proud of because they can look at LDS people and say, you abandoned the fundamentals. We are the fundamentals. We are celestial plural marriage. We are the law of consecration and the Adam God doctrine. And so that's a complicated word. Another reason why this manifesto was complicated to read is because there are Mormons that are waving the flag of fundamentalism very proudly. But in those communities, I mean, in general, Mormonism has a way of being Mormon. It is solidified in the Articles of Faith. It's also solidified in the Temple Recommend interviews that there is an orthodoxy that exists. You don't necessarily have to be that, but there is an outline of what it is to be a Mormon. And orthopraxically too, you have to answer, do you drink coffee? And that there's been a long history of contestation on, is it the tannins? Is it the caffeine? But the reality and what more and more people are saying is it's an allegiance to, this is who we are. It's a boundary of we are these people. And in the communities that I work with, there's kind of moments of this tension of progressing and how revelation works, and can revelation progress forward and be progressive. I think that exists everywhere, not just in Mormonism. But the outline of what it means to be Mormon, I think, is a little more rigid in the communities that I've spent time with, because of the nature of what they're doing.
And you see that both in terms of belief and practice. Is that right? Am I reading you right there?
Yes. And I mean, I know Latter-day Saints and Mormons across the Restoration who drink coffee, and whether you want to say that they're really Mormon or not, that's fine, but that's not my job. And I know fundamentalist Mormons that will have a beer, and I know Latter-day Saints who will have a coffee. And so that is true. However, I think the nature of being part of the fundamentalist movement is attracting a very particular kind of Mormon who is wanting something that doesn't have quite as much wiggle room. Wiggle room exists everywhere in terms of religious identity. But if you're joining a fundamentalist movement, you're joining something that's boundary maintenance is more at the forefront.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing perhaps right now in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a narrowing of what may have been for a long time the ability to be less orthodox while remaining orthoprax and remaining in sort of good standing with the community through orthopraxy. And now it's sort of a kind of conservative trend in Mormonism that it increases demands on people, but it also sort of narrows the scope of what's possible in terms of belief.
Right. And one of the things that the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto, I think we should talk about the name, but one of the things that they mention is that they're radical. When I listened to this interview with them, and they mentioned that a lot of people might look at radical orthodoxy as words that don't belong together, but I think most people read the title and read it as radically orthodox, whereas in their understanding, they were putting orthodoxy with the fundamentalist camp and radical with the progressive camp, that radical leaves room for revelation and change. And I don't know if most people read the title as quite that. But one of the things that is unique about Mormonism is that it does leave room for everything to change at any moment. Are there doctrines of the church? Absolutely. But those doctrines have changed over time. Even the core ones of, the first principle of the gospel is to know for certain the nature of God and his son, Jesus Christ, who he has sent. The nature of God has been an open question. For much of Latter-day Saint history, Brigham Young had a very idea of who and what God was versus what President Nelson believes. And so things in Mormonism can change at any point. And so that does make Mormonism very interesting in terms of what orthodoxy can look like, because it's not the same today as it was in the 19th century. And orthopraxy too, that Mormons drank coffee once and maybe not the word of wisdom still existed, but what a hot drink was different. And so that leaves room for these words of what Orthodox is to be very kind of squishy.
And I see the manifesto in these terms of radical and Orthodox. There's a long-standing tension between intellectuals, academics, and the institutional hierarchy. And the question then becomes, for conservative intellectuals, for instance, how do you navigate that tension? How do you remain an intellectual without becoming a progressive and without running afoul of the institutional hierarchy? And so I see them trying to navigate that tension here, but I definitely agree that my reading was more along the lines of radically Orthodox. We typically don't use this term in ways that the manifesto seems to be asking us to use it. And so, yeah, trying to understand what they're saying in that way can be a little bit difficult.
Right. And radical and orthodoxy means something, but radical orthodoxy means something too.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, radical orthodoxy is a movement that starts among Anglicans in the late 90s or mid to late 90s at Cambridge, actually by one of the chief thinkers, intellectuals in this movement is actually a former professor here at the University of Virginia. He's a leader in this movement at Cambridge, and he develops this idea in response to what's called radical theology, which is coming out of the death of God theology of the 60s. Broadly construed, this is like neo-orthodoxy before it, with people like Karl Barth, is a response to modernity. It's a response to movements within Christianity that are trying to accommodate to the demands that modernity makes on religious people. And we talked earlier about fundamentalists in Protestantism, and they were responding to the same sorts of things. They're responding to biblical higher criticism, to Darwin evolutionary theory. The question is, what do we do with these things that contradict what we believe, and do we accommodate to those things, or do we resist them? And so Milbank is doing a similar move here. He's resisting radical theology, which the basic premise of radical theology, of course, it's not a absolutely coherent, centralized movement, but basically it's this immanentized or getting back to the social gospel, this idea that what matters is the here and now. It's not so much about, are we going to be saved in some afterlife, or what demands does God's existence make on us, or who is God, or who is Jesus Christ. It's more along the lines of, what can we do for a world that's suffering, right? And so he's responding. He and his colleagues are responding to this idea, to this movement, and saying, actually, there are resources, philosophical and theological resources in postmodern thought that allow us to kind of critique, I guess, what you could loosely call secularism or modernity and its presumptions, its assumptions about the world, and to say, actually, what if we just went back to old school orthodoxy, early Christianity? What if we made theology and not secularism the operative presumption in the way that we look at the world? And I think that's sort of central to this idea. But this isn't the only movement that does this. Of course, you've mentioned a couple of times, Cristina, this rad-trad or radical traditionalism movement in Catholicism. So say more about that and how it sort of differs from these other movements.
Yeah, so in a few months ago, as COVID was starting, the New York Times published an article on weird Catholic Twitter. And again, speaking to a very internet version. I mean, radical traditionalism has a long history in Catholicism. In the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Church underwent a moment of great change, very much speaking to these same concerns of modernity and secularism, and many became increasingly concerned about the modernization in the church. And I hope that already starts to paint a picture that the conversations we're having are not new, right? The Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto, the conversation they're having is not new. We've been having this conversation since the inception of Christianity. But in the 1960s, there was this concern of modernization, and many radical traditionalists argued that Vatican II itself was too far and a problem. Some traditionalists argued that just the results of Vatican II were a problem. The removal of the Latin High Mass, women took their veils off, you could receive the Eucharist in your hand. And another step further, some argued that maybe the Pope is gone. And so we got a lot of groups like Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen that break off, and they're not in communion with Rome anymore because of great concern. But the New York Times ran this article in light of this, and one of the things they talked about was this concern as that people were growing more and more wanting to participate in an anti-modern vision of the Catholic faith. And the article cites that, living in an increasingly secular society, the rise of the nuns as a marker of that, not nuns, the kind in the habits that no longer wear habits because of Vatican II, but the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, that in light of that, there has been a pendulum swing to more and more people joining traditionalism. And currently we are seeing many Gen Z people becoming, going to High Latin Mass, becoming Tridentine, women wearing veils again who are in their 20s and 30s, people kneeling for the Eucharist, which it's symbolic of something that is more than just devotion to Jesus Christ. It is something that it is marker of a traditionalism that people feel is being lost. And so within that, all that to say is that these conversations of this tension between living in a society where we are perceived to be increasingly secular, and we'll talk about the problem with that, but also a desire for a time past that honestly really never existed, has created this movement that goes by rad trad. And there's a big movement online of people who have Deus Vult stickers on their computer and want the Crusades to come back, which is, a lot of it is veiled white supremacy, but and a problem because Deus Vult is a battle cry of killing people. But all that to say is there is a movement of this that is happening in Catholicism. The same conversations are happening elsewhere. That what is being talked about in the Latter-day Saint movement is not existing in a vacuum. It is not unique. It is something that Christian traditions everywhere are reconciling with right now. But it's also something that they've been doing forever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I want to loop back to this question of the secular and whether or not we're actually getting more secular, which is a question for a lot of people. Of course, we just had Peter Coviello on the show, and he had some excellent things to say about this. But before we get back to the question of where we're at now in terms of secularism and secularization, I just want to spend a few moments on contextualizing this in Christianity. So you mentioned just a moment ago that this question is as old as Christianity, right? We go back to the Christological controversies of, early, the formation of the Catholic Church, right? This is fundamentally what's at stake is, who is God? Who is Jesus Christ? And what are their attributes? And do we use Neoplatonic philosophy to access those attributes? Or, who's authorized to say things about God and who he is, right? So what is it that Orthodoxy fundamentally, in your mind, is doing? What has always been the function of Orthodoxy in Christianity?
Orthodoxy has been a boundary of correct. Orthodoxy itself is a complicated word, because if you go to Istanbul and use the word Orthodoxy, people are going to think capital O, that you were talking about the Eastern Orthodox churches. Less formally, we use lowercase o to talk about doctrines that are right and true. And every institution has this boundary of what is acceptable in Orthodox participation and belief in their faith communities, of course. What is complicated is that many Christians generally would say that Mormonism as an institution is unorthodox. LDS people would say that that Jehovah's Witnesses are unorthodox. So orthodoxy not only is an internal conversation, but it exists externally as well. And so Latter-day Saint orthodoxy is interesting now, to see them having this conversation about orthodoxy in light of other Christian communities that for so long have said, except you're not that. You are not us even, you are not Christian. And so seeing that word happen is a really interesting moment that I think speaks to the bigger kind of interesting thing about secularism. But I see orthodoxy not only as that, but I see orthodoxy quite often as what I mentioned, like a longing for this time when we knew the answers, when we had an outline of the faith that was true and pure and unadulterated. And the reality is that time has never existed. There has never been this time far gone when we were not arguing over whether Jesus Christ was consubstantial with the Father. We have been having that argument since the 300s. And so when orthodoxy is doing that, it begs the question of which orthodoxy are you talking about? And what time are you talking about that orthodoxy having happened in?
Yeah, exactly. And, when you bring up rad trad, especially with these young people, potentially religiously unaffiliated, who are coming to the Catholic Church and getting really interested in more traditional worship. I think that what we have to see there is this desire, like you're saying, for order, we live, whether or not we live in an increasingly secular world, it's certainly not a question of whether we live in an increasingly chaotic one. 2020 is at least in our own in terms of our own lifespans, it seems that things are more chaotic than ever. And people are searching for ways to anchor themselves in something that doesn't seem to be shifting out from beneath their feet. I want to talk for a few minutes about secularism and why this is a problematic framing in a lot of ways. We've brought up Peter Coviello a couple of times. Basically, in a nutshell, secularism in the United States. First of all, secularism, as Americans think about it, is a profoundly American secularism. And, it's very, of course, historically anchored in, disestablishment, the separation of church and state, right? But this distinction between public religion and private religion, or what you can do, what's legal to do in public, and what you're allowed to believe in private, actually results in another layer of I guess you could say religion, which is good religion versus bad religion, right? And that is where secularism comes in. Secularism as a what Peter Coviello would say is a tool or a discipline of the racial state, the ways that it puts people in little boxes and says, this is what you are, and this is race, and this is sex, and this is good religion, and this is bad religion. And bad religion fundamentally is what doesn't conform to the imperatives of the racial state, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about the similarities. First of all, the similarities between the operations of orthodoxy to what the state does with secularism, but also, as you pointed out, how to say that we're becoming increasingly secular is a bit of a misapprehension, right? So say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, first, like you mentioned, when we say secularism, we are talking about something that is very particularly an American version of secularism, in the same way that when people say the Enlightenment, they forgot that the Scottish one and the French one were different things. Secularism in the United States is a very different experience than secularism that is happening in Turkey. It is a very different experience than secularism that is happening in France. It is a very different experience than I have a friend who's an Anglican priest in Canada. different experience. When he uses secularism, it's not the way I'm using it. And so that's really important here, is that the way when we say secularism, we are talking about an American phenomenon. Poland is not having the same situation with secularism that we are. And so that's important. Generally, for a long time in the academy, we talked about the secularization thesis. Max Weber proposed this idea that we are living in this newly disenchanted world. But really, when have we ever been a disenchanted world? We thought we were disenchanted in the 19th century as the windows of heaven opened and the Latter-day Saint movement began. We thought we were disenchanted in all of these moments. And are we disenchanted when the religious right is still prominent? Are we disenchanted when America is still a city on the hill and the RNC? Are we disenchanted? Like, when have we really been a disenchanted people? And so, like you mentioned, especially now when we talk about secularism, much of the critiques of secularism have come out of John Modern's work, Secularism in Antebellum America. Emily Ogden wrote a beautiful book on mesmerism that kind of critiques this idea of disenchantment. Peter Caviello is part of this movement that is really critiquing what we're even talking about when we talk about becoming less religious. David Walker, who wrote Railroading Religion on Brigham Young in the Utah period. So really, when we talk about secularism in the 19th century, we weren't talking about a-religiosity or non-religiosity. Secularism in an American context has always been about religion that comports itself to liberal ideals, specifically democracy, common sense, moral reasoning. The separation of church and state was not about making people not religious. It was about making people betterly religious. That's not a real word, but within secularism, religion doesn't disappear. Religion just redefines itself. And from within the 19th century, Mormonism was not religious. It was actually considered irreligious, like Peter Caviello argues, because it didn't comport itself to the rest of Americana. And so one of the things that is interesting in terms of this conversation about radical orthodoxy is, in light of this kind of idea of what secularism is, and that secularism isn't a moment in time. It is a project. It is a thing that is done to things. It is a thing that changes things. And really, when we think of it that way, and we think of taking irreligion and comporting it to liberal ideals and making it a real religion, Mormonism underwent secularism. Mormon secularity is signed into canon in the manifesto. So when we talk about secularization, we're not talking about something against Mormonism. We're talking about something that was done to Mormonism and that continues to be done to religion generally. It's not just, Mormonism wasn't targeted necessarily. Everything was targeted that was not right religion. And so that's something that makes this interesting when people in the Latter-day Saint movement rail against secularism. In some way, they are succumbing really to Protestantism's greatest construction and perpetuating a narrative, particularly to prop up an idea of orthodoxy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the affinities between the operations of orthodoxy and the operations of the secular state or of secularism are extremely similar. And yeah, it's about what's okay, what is religion allowed to be, what should religion be, and particularly this is an issue in pluralist society, right? And that's one of the main, I guess you could say, advantages of a sort of secularizing state is that it at least gives the appearance of being able to deal with a variety of different kinds of religion, because it can say, oh, well, as long as we can turn all of these different religions into good religion, there's no problem, right? As long as they're all, in a sense, secularly orthodox, there's no problem.
Right, and that you can participate if you are a religion. That Mormonism didn't get to participate because they weren't yet a religion. They were just the theocratic thing over there with polygamy. And that was very outside the scope of what was religion. And ultimately that, brings about the argument, what is secularism? And as John Modern has talked about it, it is American Protestantism. Secularism is just a very nice way of saying American Protestantism, a very particular way of being American Protestant. that squashes things that aren't it. And so, I mean, that's kind of why the secularism critique is interesting, because Mormonism secularized from within. Mormonism is the greatest success story of the American secularization project. Because at some point, and not to say, if we take all these words to kind of mean this bigger thing, Mormonism became American. We saw this heralded in the Atlantic article. We see it something very proud that it becomes the American religion. But it had to do something to do that. It had to become secular.
Right. The central tension, the central question that the Coppens article in the Atlantic really ends on is this note of this almost plaintive note of, well, Mormonism became American just in time to realize that the America it Americanized into was already gone. And where does it go? Where does Mormonism go in its third century? And I think we see that kind of tension being worked out in this manifesto, that kind of question of, where do conservative intellectuals in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints go from here? And at least this is their answer.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's an interesting moment. It's an interesting phenomenon. One of the people who agreed with it and signed it was kind of pushed back a bit on Twitter against me, because I made the comment that you can believe things even in a radically orthodox way, and you can never sign a manifesto about it. So I think the need to not only navigate this really complicated time, but to stake a claim in it in writing, and in a way, a line is being drawn by the manifesto. People are signing their name on that line. So you can say that it's kind of this thing that we're just trying to figure out, but a stake was made.
Yeah, that's right. It's very clearly saying we are not this, and we're not this. And whether, while it's completely debatable, as we've talked about, whether it is in fact a third way, it certainly is drawing lines.
Yes, it is, absolutely. And I mean, and I think from it completely, I exist outside of Mormonism in a personal way. I think because of, like I mentioned, who's signed it, I'm not convinced that this is a third way. I'm not fully convinced of that. For me, it looks like that this is just what Latter-day Saints, Orthodox Latter-day Saints are. And so in my mind, I'm like, did we need a manifesto?
That's Cristina Rosetti. We've been chatting about the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto, as well as the concept of orthodoxy in other Mormonisms, Christianity, and religion in America. Before we go, Cristina, I'm hoping you'll share with us any Mormon studies books that you've been reading lately that you'd recommend, and give us a plug for your current projects.
Okay, so I've been reading Alyssa Maldonado Estrada's Lifeblood of the Parish. I just finished Megan Goodwin's Abusing Religion. I think that's the only religious studies things I've been reading lately, but
those are both on my list.
I have revisited Peter Coviello's work. I highly recommend Make Yourself Gods. If people haven't read Railroading Religion by David Walker, that's another great place to look for how Mormonism and secularism interact. And then for like the bigger question of Mormon secularity in the United States, it's a tough read, but read John Modern's Secularism in Antebellum America, because it really changes the conversation on how we talk about secularism. What was your second question?
Yeah, what are you working on right now?
I am finishing a biography of Saint Joseph White Musser, who was the fundamentalist Mormon leader of the 20th century, and really, I think, was the greatest intellectual contributor to what becomes the fundamentalist movement. And I'm currently revising an article on the rise of the fundamentalist movement in the 1930s. And I just finished an article for Dialogue that should be coming out next year on the nature of the Holy Ghost in Mormon fundamentalism.
Cool. Awesome. Well, we'll look forward to reading those. And thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today. This has been great.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Scholars and Saints. Next time on Scholars and Saints, join me as I chat with Dan Ellsworth, a signatory to the Radical Orthodoxy Manifesto, to get an insider's perspective on the community and its beliefs. Support for Scholars and Saints comes from the Mormon Studies program at the University of Virginia. Music is provided by Ben Howington. To hear more, visit mormonguitar.com.